I hear people make arguments talking about slavery and how slavery was not a new phenomenon in the world. How slavery has existed in almost every culture on the earth. And that's important to note when we talk about what separates or differentiates the transatlantic slave trade between historical slavery. So the transatlantic slave trade has no parallel in history. The duration, scope, and brutality have no parallel. And anyone who says this argument to minimize the effects of slavery, of the transatlantic slave trade, is trying to gaslight you. That's all it is. They are trying to appease people's consciousness by making it seem as if there is just the run-of-the-mill slavery. What made the slave trade, the transatlantic trade, so brutal was, one, the condition of service. Meaning, historically, you became a slave because your tribe lost a war, because you owed debts. Essentially, you were a slave until you paid off a debt, or until the conquest was over and peace treaties were settled and prisoners exchanges, etc. This goes for Africa, this goes back to Mesopotamia, this goes back to Rome, Greece, etc. And so when we find that what happened with the transatlantic slave trade is that there was a culture that was established to essentially create a subclass of people, where slavery and class became the focal point of it, meaning the birthright slave. Meaning if your mother was a slave, you were a slave. This issue creates a substrata of people who can no longer escape their bondage. Whereas in Roman times, you could buy your way out of slavery. Whereas in Greek time, you could be redeemed. And then people talk about how black people own slaves. But you have to remember, during the transatlantic slave trade, most blacks who owned slaves were their family members who they had purchased from their slave master, but they still had the status of slave. So we talk about slavery, but we talk about the conditions and the brutality associated with it that separates it. During transatlantic slave trade, the life expectancy of a slave who went to the Caribbean was about 7 years, meaning they worked them to death. They worked them to death. Show me historically where this happens. Show me historically where the laws and the system and the substrata of society was focused on one central issue: controlling. And we will see this. There is no parallel. And anyone who tells you there is a parallel between the transatlantic slave trade is a liar. We can talk about the Barbary slave trade. Yes, there were white people who were enslaved, who were indentured servants. Indentured servant and slavery are different. During the days of the Barbary pirates, the slave trade did not last as long. And the conditions of bondage were not as brutal, nor the life expectancy as low. In America, the average enslaved woman produced 10 children. The average. Some slave masters said if you produce 25 children, you could be released from your bondage. Imagine this, 25 children. There were slave owners who started with 2 slaves, but through birthright slavery ended up with over 300. Now let's talk about the system and how it was perpetuated, and how and why and what the reasons that it needed to be instantiated a substrata of personnel. So in the Greek days, when a Greek person took another Greek city-state person slave, a member from Athens or Macedon, they were still considered Greek. Even though they were in bondage, they were still Greek. They still had the culture. They still had the language. They still had all of the familiar bonds. They could still intermarry into their Greek customs because they were not looked at as superior, or they were looked at as the same. They were not subhuman. But what the transatlantic slave trade did is it created a subhuman strata of personnel. We can go back historical. We can go back to any time you want. And you will see that there were slave codes where slaves had rights. In America, there was a casualty killing act where you could kill a slave like a chattel, like property, like a fly. You could just kill them. Show me where this is at historical. stay focused, stay woke. This is not designed to make anybody feel some kind of way. This is designed so we can have truth. And yes, slavery is historical, but the transatlantic slave trade had no parallel. What happened in America wasn't even as, if you want to look at historical, if you go to South America, the Brazil, the only a fraction of the estimated 12 million Africans of the largest forced migration in history came to America. Only about 400,000, give or so. Most of the slaves went to the Caribbean, and they went to South America, to Brazil. And if you look at the conditions that were enslaved in Brazil, it made what happened in the Americas look tamed. Not just life expectancy, living conditions. They literally worked them until their bones fell off, to their marrow and cartilage couldn't even move anymore. Because we have to understand that the system was designed to perpetuate itself. And no other slavery in history was designed to self-perpetuate itself by birthright slavery. And no way to redeem yourself from it. Not through the court system and the law. And when we examine it, we will find that the truth leads to healing. And the truth leads to recognizing that, and the reason that people make these arguments is because they feel that just because it happened, there is no need to address the historical inequities that created from the most evil system devised by humanity. For the duration, scope, and brutality, there is none. The boat ride alone was no comparison. That's all I got.